Okay. Well, first things first, I was expecting a chance to have a wee between those two talks, so I might be going faster than I previously would have been planning to, but that's okay. First of all, this is lovely. It's nice to be in Brighton again, and it's nice to see some lovely, friendly, familiar faces, and just to be here. I'm just delighted. Hello. My name, as Mark says, my name is Phil Hawksworth, and I work at Netlify, where I'm part of the developer experience team. Let's see how we get on for time here. A professional would have timed this. I think we're okay. I think we should be all right. But we might not have time for questions. So if we don't have time for questions, that's fine, because there's going to be time after to be chatting and what have you. Also, I've always said this. I've always said you can find me on social places. I'm at Phil Hawksworth on places. I'm not really on Twitter anymore, if I'm very, very honest. So you can find me at Phil Hawksworth in most places. I'm on Mastodon at the moment. You can find me there. I guess what I should probably start doing is I should probably start putting this on there, which is my website. This is my domain that I registered 25 years ago, and it's still there. It's been through a few incarnations since it started. It's also the first example in this slide deck of a fact. Naming is hard. Hawksworks is how that's pronounced. Idiot. 25 years ago, I thought that was cool. I thought, just drop the last couple of letters from my name, put an X on it, that'll make sense. Hawksworks, how's that? Idiot. So naming is hard, and we will see that again. Full disclosure, this slide is coming your way in a moment. Naming is hard. We're going to talk about rendering. Now, the word render has been used a couple of times already today, and hopefully I'm not teaching you something that you already know. I'm not going to show you any code. I'm going to show you some lines and boxes. I think the why is really important, so maybe I'll touch on some different areas to things that you've thought of in the past. But what am I talking about when I say rendering? Well, I'm talking about making and delivering HTML, and I'm talking about controlling the DOM. I'm talking about manipulating things in the browser. I have to confess, the first time I said something rendering on the server just before Frontiers Conference, the night before Frontiers Conference in Amsterdam back in 2013, I was having a chat in the bar, and I dropped this expression in, rendering on the server, and the person I was talking to started laughing in my face. They said, "Do you mean serving HTML?" And yes, I did. And so 10 years ago, the idea of rendering on the server seemed to be laughable. Now we just use that terminology all the time. But, you know, I kind of hanker for the good old days. You know, I liked life simple, where we made stuff, we put it on a server, and then someone came along and asked for it, and we delivered to the client, and then the client showed it. That was lovely and it's simple, and it worked for my little brain. But then it got more complicated. Of course it did. We're building more sophisticated things. We're building bigger sites. So the server started to do work. They weren't just serving assets. Now they were building things. You know, we wanted to have server-side includes. We wanted to have templating. Maybe we were delivering something specific to the user, depending on what they asked for. And of course, the server started doing some of the work and then delivering that to the client. And then we moved along a bit further, and then the client started doing work instead as well. Of doing, you know, the work of manipulating the DOM, changing things with JavaScript in the front end, rendering different views in the client. And I've got feelings about this. You know, back in the day, you know, I used to talk a lot about unobtrusive JavaScript. We used to be banging this drum about saying, let's not litter the HTML with JavaScript. Let's make sure that the HTML, as Jeremy talked about, was like the base layer. This would deliver the content, and then we can layer things on progressively on top of that. And you know, this idea of robustness was very much something that was at the core of this. And you know, Jeremy was just mentioning how these different layers have different levels of fragility, frankly. And so I've always been a fan of trying to adhere to the rule of least power. You know, trying to decide to use the least powerful tool for the job, because, you know, inherent in that is the least failure point and the least likelihood for it to either break or be complex to understand. You know, this idea has become a little bit more complicated in this world. But when I think about this paradigm here of just the server and the client, of course, we've come along a little way from there. I've been advocating for making the server dumb and just I'm careful using that phrase. And only having the job of serving the assets that are given to it. I like the idea very much of a build step, first of all, that's automated, that does the work long before the client ever asks for anything. Then it adds it to some kind of serving infrastructure that the client can then get access to. But in reality, there's more of this. Now we've got serverless compute, we've got things happening at the edge, which we'll talk about in a minute. We've got lots of places that work can happen, including still on the server. So when it comes to generating a view, comes to rendering, by thunder, there are a lot of ways to approach rendering. I've just realized how awful it is to quote yourself while you're saying something. Well, I do apologize. There are reasons for that. So there's a lot of confusion around rendering. And we talk a bit sometimes about where rendering happens, and there's a place where rendering happens. Is it on the server or on the client? I also like to think it's important to consider the time that rendering happens as well. When is a rendering going to happen? I want to talk a little bit about what, where, when, how, and why. I'll be honest, I'm not going to talk about how. There's only limited time here. We're not going to go into code examples. I like to, as I say, draw lines and boxes and think about some of these other things. Hopefully that'll be good kind of thought starters. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes or so. I hope you can see this at the back. Sorry, this may be a tiny bit small. 10 minutes or so kind of just thinking about what rendering models exist and just talking about some terminology, maybe just questioning what those are. And then about 10 minutes looking at a couple of examples that apply those techniques. So that's the aim. And then after that, until they kick us out, gossiping, probably discovering even more names for rendering, and names of view as well. So keen to chat afterwards. So let's get into it. So examining rendering, what even do those acronyms all mean? So terminology creeps in where technology lives. It just happens all the time. And I did warn you, naming is hard, and here's that slide that I promised would be on its way. Let's not unpack all of these. Some of them will be very familiar to you. Some of them may be not so familiar. It kind of depends where you've been digging. But let's just talk about a few of them. I think one or two of them have some misconceptions that are common, which is why I'm keen to talk about this. So let's do that. Let's start with this one. So SSG, static site generation. I mentioned a moment ago about this idea of, in this, this landscape of where things are happening, doing something in a build environment before it even gets to the server. So this might be either built on your local machine or in some kind of continuous integration, continuous deployment environment, something where build automation can happen. It just so happens that I work for a company that does that. That's the only reason I mention it. Of course, it can happen in those places. It can happen in development environments also. And it's happening when? Well, it's happening before anything's ever been requested. So I like the idea of putting distance between the complexity and things that can fail and the user that might be requesting it. The mistakes don't leave the kitchen, if you like. I like that a lot. And I use this slide sometimes in other decks where I talk about, I'm cautious about some of the language, but let's roll with it anyway. Like a traditional stack that maybe we think about, which might have web servers, many of those perhaps behind a load balancer or a few of those that are talking to databases, and requests go up that chain and come back to the client that's requesting it. And then this other stack where we've pre-generated things and put them on a CDN, content delivery network, and those get returned to the user when they request them. And this idea of like a build happening before time, and those builds being triggered by changes to either code or content or other services that are connected to that. This is all happening ahead of time. I'm really aware as well that this slide smells like a pitch because I've got this word up here, the company I work for. Let's replace that. Various increasingly popular providers. I'm not going to pretend that Netlify invented this. This is an old pattern. I think we're just trying to codify it, and there are plenty of competitors who do something similar. So let's get away from that, and let's just talk about the model of that. Okay, this other model, CSR, client-side rendering. Again, where is this happening? Well, this is happening in the browser, in the client. But when is it happening? This is happening at request time. A request has happened, something's been delivered, and then maybe more requests are having to be made to get more data. Things are being executed in the browser. in JavaScript. And as per Jeremy's kind of comment earlier on, JavaScript is a little less fault tolerant than some of the other parts of the stack, but nonetheless, this is incredibly popular, as I'm sure you all know, and we see it in lots of different frameworks. Okay, so I think these first terms, no problem so far. SSR, now this is oddly where I found it gets interesting. So server-side rendering seems to be a phrase that I hear used to mean a multitude of different things. So this is rendering that's happening in the server at request time. So in response to a request that's coming from the client, we're generating a response and delivering that. But what is the server? That's an unusual thing. So this is, in our little diagram again, here's the server, the application server, the web server that's generating that. But I hear people use the term SSR for server-side rendering actually to mean all of this. Any server. So what they're actually talking about very often when I hear people mention that, if we look at this view, is, well, there's the client-side rendering and then there's the stuff that's not the client. That's the server side. Is that the server side? It's not the client side. So often I hear all of this being referred to as the S in SSR, which I don't think is quite right because, as I say, it's the when is just as important as the where. So SSR I think of as this. So it's happening on some sort of stateful application server that's running code, that's running executions at request time in response to requests. Okay, I thought I'd taken this slide out, but here it is anyway. Oddly, like the converse of this, so this is a server, this is a little side quest. I think about the exact opposite of this, so everything except the server is kind of where Jamstack lives. I don't know, maybe people have heard the term Jamstack. It's kind of going out of vogue, I think, a little bit, because frankly, it's a confusing term, because it used to just mean this, and a bit of this, and now it means this. I don't know, it's difficult. I think of it as just anything that doesn't include an active server to maintain. Anyhow, naming is hard. Okay, shall we move on to another one? So ESR, I hadn't heard this until recently. I'd been using language for this exact same thing, but I hadn't heard this acronym. Edge-side rendering. Oh, we're deep down the rabbit hole now. So where is this happening? Well, it's not on a server, it's not on the client, it's at the edge, whatever that is. Well, when we're serving things from a content delivery network, that's geographically spread around the planet. And the edge is considered part of that network which is close to where your users reside. So the ability to run computations and run functions close to where those users are is great for speeding up responses, having fast latency or low latency responses to things. So we can actually do compute there as well. It's not on a server, it's typically serverless, functions as a service, so it's a serverless runtime that's happening there, but it's another place that things can be executed. Going back to this diagram once again, this is almost like an enhancement, if you like, or a way to embellish things that have already been rendered and generated and put onto a CDN. Now we can use edge rendering as well to either manipulate those responses, enhance them, and do other kinds of computation there. But it lives out of the server environment, out on the edge of a network, if you like. And I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. I am all for doing as much as possible up that end of the stack as possible. The more we can do ahead of time, the more risks we avoid of things breaking later on, I believe. So are you saying that you think SSGs are best, Phil? Well, it depends. Delighted to say that now. And some of you might be saying, it depends on what, Jeremy? And I'm glad you asked, because I actually think it depends is an incredibly important response to these things if it's followed by it depends on what, and you are going to interrogate those things. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But I kind of engaged in a bit of thoughtful debate about exactly this recently, and like most people, if I want to have a polite, informed discussion, I went to Twitter for that. So there was a discussion going on about the types of rendering and whether you should do things server-side or not. This might be a little bit hard to read, so I'll blow it up a little bit. And so I was saying this, I think server-side doesn't have to mean server full. Again, if you think of that diagram where we had the client and not the client, there's a lot up this end that maybe you might think of server-side, but It doesn't have to be on a physical server. My approach to rendering things is if I can do things in advance, I will. But if I can't, and I can do things in a serverless way, I'll do that. And if I can't, and I have to use a server, I will. I would never say, never use a server. And I would never say, never use serverless. I would always think it's about layering these things on. Starting with the simplest thing possible and then layering on complexity when they're demanded. Kind of like thinking again of the rule of least power. I think of that in terms of environments as well. Okay, let's get on to some different terminology and things that feel a little bit more complicated when it comes to rendering. Doing things incrementally. So here are a bunch of terms, and I've got good news for you. One of them isn't real, so the last one that's how I feel when I see all the expressions, so we can get rid of that one. And I've got more good news for you. 3 of these things basically mean the same thing, and the 4th one sometimes means basically the same thing. But we'll get to this in a second. So the first 3, these terms came from Netlify and from Gatsby, and the 4th one is one that you'll see used in the Next ecosystem. So let's talk about the chances of maybe these 3 things all just conflating into one name in future, because I don't know if you heard, but Netlify acquired Gatsby recently, so maybe we can unify these terms. I wouldn't have thought so. I think it's very unlikely. I don't know if anyone has ever been working remotely, enjoying conversation with colleagues in a Slack or some other kind of chat forum. But what happened shortly after the Gatsby team joined Netlify is we started trying to figure out, well, what is this company going to be called? I mean, it's going to be Netlify. It was an acquisition. It wasn't a merger, but that's by the by. One of the suggestions was Gatlify. One of the suggestions was Netsby. One of them was Getslify. And then one of them was Natsflibby. Now, I don't think anyone will be surprised to learn that this was the runaway winner. And so a branding exercise is underway at the moment. TLDR, naming is hard. So given that this is the kind of discussion that's happening about a name, the chances of these all conflating into one, I don't know. I think we have to make it happen by just adopting one. But let's talk about what they actually are before I kind of lose my way. So DPR, Distributed Persistent Rendering. It's a mouthful. And this is the term that Netlify came up with as an approach to saying some of the things you're going to generate, some of the views you're going to render during a build. You're going to generate that view at build time. But maybe you want to persist other views into that set of assets that's been built some other time in some other place, so perhaps at request time. It's fine as a name, but I don't love it. What we also then did was say, well, we have a product called On-Demand Builders that implement this approach. I get this much better. Okay, this is something that I run on demand when a request happens, and it builds something and it adds it to the cache. Great. Gatsby had a similar thing. They called it DSG, Deferred Static Generation. It was their implementation of DPR in the same way that Netlify's was ODB. I much prefer this title that Gatsby came up with, Deferred Static Generation, because it seems very descriptive to me. It seems like, yeah, we're going to generate some static asset that will then start serving, but we'll defer that until it's asked for. All of them mean this. Don't generate it in the build, wait until the first time it's requested, then generate it and add it to what was built earlier on. So in other words, we slowly populate more and more content into this build cache only when things are requested. That has an acronym as well. I have said it's hard. I don't think that one's going to catch on. So this is all, something that happens thanks to serverless runtimes that can add this kind of capability. When people come and request a resource on a URL that doesn't exist yet because it wasn't part of the build, then we build it and we add it to the set of the resources that are statically there available to be used. And this is a pattern that's kind of catching on in lots of different places. The other one here, ISR, so incremental static regeneration, another bit of a mouthful. This is an implementation of a pattern called stale while we validate, and it does largely the same thing as the others, but just with a slight bit of nuance and difference. Let's just try and visualize it because it's hard when I'm just waving my hands around. So on-demand builders, we were talking about earlier on. So until a user comes and requests a view, it doesn't exist, it's not there. Once the user comes along, a function renders out that view, populates it, and now every future user asking for something on that URL will get that view. ISR, or rather stale while revalidate, I should say, rather than ISR. Stale while revalidate is a little bit different in that a view is rendered, ahead of time, but it might need to be refreshed. So it's stale until we revalidate that. So a user comes along, they will get a view, but it will be a stale view. But that act of making that request will refresh that. It will go off and it will create a new view for subsequent users to get. So that will be refreshed. And then each time that happens, another view is made and it slowly goes stale. Now you can trigger different caching behaviors. Anyone have fun controlling caching behaviors? Liar, one liar. I point at the liar in the red hat. It's difficult, but it's complex, but they're different. I should also say as well that ISR can be configured to work in a number of different ways now, and one of them is exactly the same as this. So lots of terms, but they're ultimately doing something that's very, very similar. You might ask, which is better, ISR or DPR? It depends. Of course it depends. It depends on what's being built. It depends on the functionality that's required. Like, what's the non-functional requirements as well? What's the size of the site? How frequent are the updates? Lots of things will drive your decision for that. Naming is hard, as I keep on saying, but deciding demands questions. Choosing between these things really requires questions. So what are the requirements is a key question that we should be asking whenever we're trying to decide how we should render something. Okay, I've spoken for 20 minutes. Let's get 10 minutes of examples. And I've got a couple of examples that I want to show you that they're actually quite similar in terms of the technique, but I just want to use them as an illustration. So the first one is about archiving social posts, self-hosting thousands of posts. This has come off the back of deciding personally to move off Twitter and wanting to have an archive of all my tweets somewhere else. So I thought this would be a fun project to think about different ways that I could render. So I started, even though it's a personal project, of course I was going to think about this, so what were the requirements? Well, I wanted a URL for every one of the 24,000 or so tweets that I had. I wanted an index page that listed every one of those tweets with its URL, and I wanted that to be generated ahead of time so that it could be crawlable and discoverable and all the rest of it. I wanted the ability to search the tweets, especially since I've discovered, but setting my account to private on Twitter now, search is gone, sadly. So I wanted my own ability to search my own tweets on my own site. I wanted to retain a reasonable build time. Now I have a blog that's got a couple of hundred pages on it and it built in about a second. I wanted that to stay reasonable. So 24,000 pages was going to be a challenge. So this is a good contender for an experiment. I wanted to avoid client-side rendering if at all possible because I wanted to deliver things as HTML. That's my preference. And I wanted the logical model of this to be something that fits in my head because I could easily introduce a ton of complexity. Let's see how we get on. So, I mean, I decided I would use static site generation. I would use on-demand builders to gradually augment what was there in the build. And I would do something at the edge using ESR. So let's look at that and see if I can possibly get through it in time. I think I can. So this all started with a big old dirty, great big blob of JSON. I exported my set of content from Twitter. It came back down as a big archive of JSON. But this could have been content that was populated from anything, pulling things in from a content API or pulling things in from a headless CMS or what have you. But on this occasion, this is a blob of JSON that wasn't going to change. So I pulled that down ahead of time. And I wanted a build that would generate some pages from that. So I had a build that was looking at that blob of content, that blob of JSON, and applying that to some templates that I'd written. And that would generate some assets, some HTML pages that I would then be able to serve from somewhere. So from doing that, I've got the rest of the content pages on my site and that kind of index page that lists all of the tweets that I had. So I had that paginated over a few pages. So that was all generated in the build so that when a user came along and asked for that, it was ready to go. It was statically generated. So you might not be able to see this particularly well, but I'll describe it to you. And also, don't worry, it's not too exciting. So this is the list of my paginated list of tweets on my page, and I can kind of just use the pagination to go next and backwards and forward through it. So there's 955 pages that those were covered across that were all generated ahead of time. Each page has kind of got a nice URL so I can page through it, and all of this is built up front so that it's discoverable. I really want Google to be able to find my quality tweets. Looking back through some of the content here was eye-opening, particularly the early stuff. So that worked perfectly fine. My build duration, stayed at around 2 to 3 seconds on Netlify where I'm building it. Locally, it's still about a second, which surprises me. For about 1,200 pages, so I'm using 11T for my site generation. You could be using woohoo. Did I hear a whoop there, or was it in my head? Because I realized I reacted to it, not realizing if it was real. Okay, let's say it was real. But of course, you could use any site generator, anything that can turn data and templates into HTML. But yeah, so this is the kind of duration I was having on my site build with that. So that's great. That gets us a certain amount of the way there. But then what about the URLs for every one of those pages? Well, that sounds like a perfect contender for something on demand, an on-demand builder that we were talking about earlier on. So this is effectively a serverless function that pages or other requests on a particular pattern will go there rather than going to my assets. And then what I do with that function is I look up the data from my blob of JSON, apply a template to it, it generates some HTML, which I then add to the set of assets that's already been generated. This sounds complicated, but there's lots of helpers that that do this for me, that can simplify this process. So by doing that, that means that now I've got a post view for every one of those pages. And so that means that, back to our little demo here, as I'm scrolling around, I'm actually now really pleased that this is quite small so that you can't see the thing that I was shouting about and all excited about just a few days ago, on my birthday no less, was how excited I was to have a piece of toast. It's the small pleasures. But there we are, we've got a URL for every one of these. This one, as it turns out, is from Mastodon because I'm aggregating that content as well, but the model is the same. So now we've got 23,000 or so URLs that can be served. This was served up in less than 300 milliseconds, I'd say, and now every subsequent visit to this page thankfully won't have to wait that time. That job is done. It's added to my build cache. So come get this content while it's hot, everybody. Okay, what's next? Let's add search to this now. Well, in this case, I'm using something at the edge. I'm using edge functions for this. I'm using edge side rendering. I had to think about the acronym once again. And so in this occasion, when a request comes for the user for search, I'm doing something very, very similar to actually what's happening in the build. I'm going off and I'm comparing all of the data that I have in JSON and then rendering out one of those listing pages again, but it's been filtered based on the search result. That search I'm doing is incredibly dumb, by the way. I'm just doing string matching against my 4 megabytes of JSON. And it seems to work quite well. It returns the response direct to the user. So this logic is all happening, not client-side, but not client-side, server-side or serverless side, if you like. And so in that way, I get results pages all with the URL as well. So let's have a little look at that. I can search in here, search for Brighton, as I did earlier on. I'm going to hit return. It searched my 23,860 notes and found 58 items, and it's listed those in the same view as I had before. First thing is talking about this event, which is nice. Okay, I won't make you stream through all of my thoughts about Brighton and what have you. But a nice thing is that I get a URL for this, so I can share a search page with people, and I think real URLs are important when it comes to delivering content. Okay. So that's that. I've got a couple of minutes left. I'll show you another example, which is actually doing something similar, but has another piece in there as well. So this is, sorry, forgive me. This is for an affordable housing project. So I help with a non-profit based in Silicon Valley that tries to find affordable housing for people of difficult means. And so there's a huge database that's gathered from, I say huge, it's not huge enough. There's a database which has been aggregated of different locations around the area where affordable housing is available, and trying to make sure that that's searchable by people is really important. So some of the requirements for this, again, a URL for each of the properties, an index page listing each of the properties with its URL, sounding very familiar to my tweets example, the ability to filter and search, again, quite familiar, retain a reasonable build time, again, Avoid client-side rendering if possible. This was critically important because the people searching this often have incredibly antiquated devices if they've got a device at all. So having something that would work with minimal power requirements, minimal overhead and failure rates based on JavaScript in handheld devices was really important. So I wanted to deliver HTML for this. And also the content was going to be managed by many in a number of different data sources. So again, I used a static site generator for this. I used ODB to enhance this and have or embellish the build afterwards. And also we did something at the edge for search. The model looks exactly the same as what I just showed you. But in actual fact, there's another piece here. So we used Airtable as the place for people to gather the data, and it would actually generate a set of data that we would then use in the build and build this out. So I'm coming up on time, so I'll just let this play very, very quickly. So this is the site. It's a very simple looking static site with a bunch of pages which are managed actually through Airtable. There are lots of resources here. And then there's this database of 400 and something properties which are all kind of listed on this page. Each of these has a page that is actually rendered on demand. But then also you can filter this. Again, this is a static site, effectively embellished with a couple of different attributes. Then we can update this list. It will filter it down and give you, based on your search results. This site works entirely without JavaScript, except for things like the map there. But all of the core data, all of the actual content is available without JavaScript and searchable without JavaScript as well, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but these days seems to be more and more of a big deal. Okay, I'm at time, so I'll do this very, very quickly, I promise. So what are the main lessons here? So first of all, there's no one right way when it comes to rendering. There are lots and lots of choices, and we've got to figure out what's the right choice for the circumstance we're working with. I do believe that the more work you can do ahead of time, the better. So the more we can do in a pre-generation step, the better, I believe. You can mix and match these rendering models. So you can start with something that's pre-generated and then embellish it with things like on-demand builders or edge functions or what have you. You should never really choose your approach until you've understood the requirements, because very often we're just using the wrong tools for the job, and I think we can simplify. Lastly, not all of Phil's tweets are pure gold. Take of that what you will. And then the very last thought really is naming is hard. Okay, I'm a minute over, so apologies, but I am done, so thank you very much for listening. Thanks a lot.